Yeah, the awareness for everything. Yeah. Well,
Okay, everyone. We're going to get started today. Thank you all for coming. I'm Tyler, and if none of you have ever been here before, thank you for coming to the archives and welcome. Today we have Mark Johnson, who will be talking about Chinese women in Montana from the 1860s to 1950s. A worthy ambition for a Chinese girl, the changing status of Chinese women 1860s to 1950s. This talk explores how Chinese cultural traditions and American legal obstacles severely limited the number of Chinese women throughout Montana's Chinese communities. This made the formation of Chinese American families difficult and made it harder for Chinese communities to take root in Montana than other ethnic groups. Despite these challenges, several extraordinary Chinese women exhibited remarkable perseverance and strength, carving out influential roles within their communities and beyond. Again, thank you, Mark, for being willing to present.
Thank you, Tyler. I think this mic is picking up. Can you hear me in the back? Good. When Tyler reached out and asked me to talk, I noticed his last name, Trunowski, and I thought, hey, I was a math major for a couple of weeks up at Carroll College, and I had his grandfather as a professor up there, and then I realized that math wasn't my thing. I was more interested in Pythagoras' history than his theorem necessarily, and so I switched to being a history major, and that took me down this path, but it was nice to see that family name and to make that connection. I'm from Great Falls. I live currently in Helena, but you can see I work for the University of Notre Dame. It's confusing. I work for that great university out in northern Indiana, live in Montana, and do most of my work out in California. So I'm kind of all over the place. But my primary work is to train K through 12 teachers. All this stuff on the Chinese in Montana is just my hobby. I lived for 8 years in China, and as I was spending my summers back here, but the academic year over there, I found a number of documents, all in Chinese, that we translated. I had my students and their grandmas and grandpas and connections translate these documents from a gentleman working in Butte, who was writing back and forth to family members in southern China. And we did that over a number of years. I brought students from Shanghai here to Montana, translated these documents to try and tell the history of Montana's Chinese as much as possible in their own words. And that's what the first book is on, The Middle Kingdom Under the Big Sky. I will be selling copies of that after the talk for $30. The paperback just came out and it dropped the price point considerably from what the hardback was. The next project, you can see these blown up colorful panels on the edge. My youngest son Thomas and I, he's a freshman in high school out of Boulder High Jefferson High in Boulder, and we're working on a graphic and illustrated history of the Chinese experience in Montana. And we've got an illustrator out of San Francisco's Chinatown, a great illustrator named Rich Lee, who came up to Butte a couple of months ago. And so we're trying to tell Montana's Chinese history in a visual way based again on those sources as much as we can. Now, telling the history of Montana's Chinese is not easy, because it didn't seem like there was much that they left behind. I know Butte, I love Butte, and Butte always turns out for talks like this. I almost think we could jump just to the question and answer period, because you guys know so much about the history, you can just jump right in, you're so engaged and interested. But the Chinese experience is hard to tell because of what sources they left behind. They were a very important part of Montana Territory and then Montana State. Okay? In the first territorial census of 1870, Chinese Montanans made up about 10 to 12% of all non-native people in Montana. A massive part of the community. But even on a census like that notes how many there are, it's hard to mine those sources. So you can see this is a snippet from the territorial census of Montana in 1870 up in Helena. Yeah, we've got what occupation they have, what gender, how old they are, where they're from, but their names elude us. They're recorded as anonymous, quote, China man or, quote, China woman, or we have China boy here, right? And so their identities, their family structures, who they were, escapes from us. And it's difficult to then find them in other documents, right? If we're looking to try and triangulate who this Chinese woman is, she's 20 years old in 1870, she keeps home. Okay, if we had her name, maybe we could find her in immigration records or newspaper accounts or something like that, but her identity is stripped from her in 1870. Now that's particularly hard for Chinese men, who were the vast majority of the Chinese in Montana, but even more difficult for Chinese women, though they were quite small in number. They suffered in Montana and across the American West quite a bit more anti-Chinese rhetoric and at times anti-Chinese violence. And an early Montana founding father, this gentleman here, Thomas Dimsdale, a newspaper editor and a key figure in early Montana, kind of gave the anti-Chinese sentiment when he said, quote, "The yellow-looking bipeds called China women, God save the mark. They debauch our citizens and degrade the community." So an early government official in Montana is talking with this amount of vitriol against not just Chinese people, but Chinese women. And this idea of debauching and degrading our community, it was thought of as this idea that Chinese women in the American West, 100% of them worked as prostitutes, was the thought. The reality was not that. But here you can see from the Butte Miner in '02, I love this colorful image, right? You've got the red light district, but the red is this Chinese dragon that's encircling the red light casino district and things like that. And there was this idea that the Chinese women who did make their way to the American West worked as sex workers. There is some truth to that in a number of cases, but to say that all of them did is a vast overgeneralization and disrespect to their true role in the American West. Early during the time when Chinese came to Montana, Chinese workers were allowed to bring their wife in. Chinese workers could bring wives in. That stopped with some regulations in the 1870s and 1880s. But on the early 1870 census, there were 128 Chinese women across Montana. And we know that they could be wives of the Chinese workers. That changed with legislation that was passed down along the way. Now sometimes we might think that, well, in Chinese culture, which is a very male-dominated culture, that maybe it was a prohibition in China against women going out for work. And that's why there's so few Chinese women in the American West. There's some credence to that, but if we look at comparative studies of other places where the Chinese from the same area of China went out for work, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, South Africa, we could get a sense of if the gender imbalance was the same as it is here in the American West, then maybe it could totally be attributed to Chinese culture. It wasn't. In Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Australia, South Africa, the gender ratio, the number of Chinese women and men was far closer than it was in Montana and in the American West. So we'll keep that in mind. And what the real reason for that is politicians like this guy. Good name, bad sentiment. Representative Albert Johnson out of Washington said the necessity to bar Chinese women from gaining entry arises from the fact that we do not want to establish additional, quote, Oriental families here. So it was very intentionally structured because they knew that if Chinese women came in, Chinese American families could take root. So we'll keep that idea in mind. Closer to home, Wilberforce Sanders, an important founding father, vigilante, and early politician, said, "It is not desirable that these people, the Chinese in Montana, shall be multiplied in this country, but that they shall be diminished to extinction." Diminished to extinction. Now, you could take that as you scratch the surface of that a little bit and violence is underneath that. You could, I think also in a familial sense, it was made very difficult for Chinese families to take root in Montana. And that diminished to extinction. He says this in 1892-93 right in there. And here's the overall graph of the Chinese in Montana. Okay, you can see it reached its peak in 1890 at 2,532 Chinese in Montana. Sometimes you will hear that attributed to Butte. Sometimes when you talk about the Chinese experience in Montana and in Butte, you'll hear that there was 2,532 Chinese in Butte. That's a sloppy footnoting situation that happened back in the 1960s, where a researcher does indeed say that. She cites her own work as her source for that. You go back to her original work, and it's clear that she's talking about Montana. Okay. Now, Butte did have a massive Chinese population, about 1,000 in 1890, so a very important, probably the largest Chinese community in the Rocky Mountain West. But that number that's sometimes ascribed is out of an error. But you can see when Wilberforce Sanders says that they shall be diminished to extinction, maybe indeed that was true, right? I think a lot of that is based on the impossibility of Chinese people becoming Chinese American families. And we see that because of the gender ratio that we talked about. In 1870, for every 14 Chinese men in Montana, there's one Chinese woman. In 1880, 20 to 1. The 1890 census was destroyed by fire in the 1920s, and so we don't have specific page-by-page accounts in 1890. We jumped to 1900 though, and that ratio has widened to 40 Chinese men for every 1 Chinese woman, right? And so also understanding Chinese culture, how important it is to get married and have children, it's an imperative that cannot be ignored. One of the reasons for that is passing on the family line, passing on inherited wealth, things like that. But most importantly, in a religious, cultural sense, you needed to produce descendants who could then honor ancestors who passed on by giving offerings and keeping those who have passed into the next life happy so that they could shower fortunes on those in the present. And if you didn't have children, you couldn't keep those ancestors happy through that. And so part of the documents that we translated for that implore this Chinese guy working in Butte, working in laundries in the 1880s and 1890s, and they're constantly saying, send more money, send more money, send more money, come home and get married, send more money. And the money he was sending and people like him were sending wasn't just frivolous to live extravagantly. It kept families alive in southern China. The region that we're going to talk about where most of them are from, the income needed to run that region, 80% of it was foreign earned. So laundries, restaurants, Chinese gardens here were literally keeping extended family alive in southern China. But also that imperative to get married. So we hear this, quote, you left our country for more than 20 years. Our family eagerly expects you to come back according to the original plan. It will be best if you can get married here. You can have offspring for our forefathers and glorify our family. It is a fundamental family tradition. And it absolutely was. But it was difficult. It was difficult to both be working here and to find a bride to produce children. Right? It did happen at times. When telling the history of the Chinese in Montana, it's tempting to just focus on Butte, America. And I want to broaden that lens as much as possible. I want to get into Billings, I want to get into Kalispell, Helena, and beyond the great city of Butte. And so we have one example of this gentleman in the bottom left, Mario. He was a laundry worker, a restaurant worker up in Columbia Falls, Whitefish, and Kalispell. He got in before the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But he was a worker, and so he couldn't bring a wife in after those restrictions had made it impossible. He does indeed get married. This is his wife back in southern China, and their first son. Mario traveled back and forth to southern China as frequently as he could to try and keep his family going and father children, right? That fundamental cultural imperative. Tragically, things don't work out very well for his family. He's living and working here in Whitefish. His wife is back in southern China with their children. A Japanese bombing raid in 1937 kills the wife and the children. Right? And so when we talk about the Chinese in the West, sometimes you will hear, well, they were bachelors. It was a bachelor society. No, these are complicated families. Transnational, split households that could easily result in that type of heartbreak that unfortunately Mario suffered. He continued to live in Montana until the 1950s when he died, a widower, and he's buried in an unmarked grave just outside of Kalispell. So trying to keep those cultural imperatives alive, but separated due to distance and increasingly stringent American laws was difficult. Speaking of those American laws, I'm sure you've heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It barred workers like Mario. It barred laundry workers, restaurant workers, people with important skills but unskilled workers, right? 7 years before that, it had barred Chinese women from coming in. In 1875, there was something called the Page Act, and it assumed every Chinese woman trying to gain entry to the West was going to work as a prostitute. And so to try and uphold the moral standing of the country, it tried to bar Chinese women from getting in. And so you had these heartbreaking stories of these families split by thousands of miles and by thousands of miles of red tape. I mentioned Jefferson County. I drove down from Helena today, drove through Jefferson County, County 51, right? Here's a snippet from the census of 1900. What do you notice about gender? All men. What do you notice about marital status? As I did this study, about half of the Chinese men in Jefferson County were married, and not one Chinese woman rose on the census. So there was not one Chinese woman in Jefferson County, and yet about half of these men are married. So it's not a bachelor society. They're complicated transnational split households. Now, you might say to yourself, well, Mark, the Chinese in Montana, they don't have to intermarry with just other Chinese people, right? They could occasionally marry outside their race, but that didn't go too well. Here's an account from 1873 in Blackfoot, Montana. Quote, when a white man voluntarily ties himself to a China woman and thereby becomes her lawful husband, we consider it a barbarous act. The citizens of that town, it is said, are greatly incensed at the base outrage perpetrated in their midst and threaten the offender against public morals and decency with a coat of tar and feathers. It is the only instance recorded in Montana intermarriage with a heathen Chinyi, and it is hoped that it would be the last. Right? Now, it probably wasn't the only instance, but shortly after this, it was codified into law that Chinese people in Montana could not marry outside their race. So it's called an Anti-Miscegenation Act. From 1909 to 1953, Chinese people in Montana could not marry anybody of any other ethnicity. That will complicate our story when we get to one of Butte's most famous Chinese residents a little bit later. And we look at the area of China that the Chinese who came here were from. It's mostly in this Guangdong province, just outside of Canton or Guangzhou, China, southern China, specifically these 4 counties, specifically this county of Taishan. And life in Taishan was extremely difficult in the 19th century. Population growth had boomed, it had challenged the food supply, typhoons, earthquakes, epidemics, famines, wars, rebellion, made life in Taishan County very, very difficult. This area of China had also had a long history of people leaving for work. You notice it's on the South China Sea. A lot of people, even back to the Ming Dynasty, had been leaving this area to go to work in the Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia. So there was that tradition that there was an option to leave for work, and many of them did. But we talk about, about 80% of the Chinese who came to North America, Canada and Mexico included, were from Taishan County. Okay? Life was very, very difficult. It was said in a Chinese source, the able-bodied go abroad. The fields are clogged with weeds. Sadly, daughters are often drowned rather than raised. So very, very difficult situation. Occasionally there was a way out for these young girls, though. It was called the Muay Tsai system. Muay Tsai is Cantonese for little sister. And what emerged in this area is the selling of girls. It was hoped that they would be sold as kind of indentured servants to a family that upon turning 18 would free them and give them some marital prospects and things like that. And the families down in southern China, when faced with these horrible choices, crossed their fingers and hoped that that was the future for the daughter that they were selling off. You can tell with my tone that that's not how it often happened. Often the Muay Thai who were sold into this were sold into sexual servitude and found themselves in the brothels of San Francisco's Chinatown or in related areas. Now, thankfully, there were some good-natured progressive reformers who tried to combat this system. This woman here, Donaldina Cameron, and this is in San Francisco. You can kind of tell the slope. It's a hilly area, right? Cameron House still stands in San Francisco's Chinatown and still does progressive work, educational work, outreach to Chinatown's residents. But back in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Donaldina Cameron made it her goal to try and go into San Francisco's brothels and extricate as many of these Chinese girls and women as she possibly could, with the goal of anglicizing them, of Christianizing them. It was said she had an organization to teach them how to organize a home on Christian principles and take the first steps upward from heathenism to civilization. So you can tell she doesn't necessarily admire Chinese culture necessarily, but she is doing honorable work to try and get these girls and women out of the situation. And closer to home, so all these girls, if they're extricated from that, then what's their future? They're taught English, they're taught Christianity, and maybe they could be made marriageable prospects for the large group of Chinese men across the American West who had no other prospects to marry. And there's a happy story to that. Dr. Wajin Lam in Butte, he was the first Chinese man to graduate from USC with a medical degree, right? And he comes up here to Butte and starts a doctor's office, right? A Chinese herbal doctor in Chinese traditional medicine with Western medicine because he studied at USC as well. But he doesn't have a family. And so he writes to Donaldina Cameron and her work down in San Francisco and tries to find a bride. And Donaldina Cameron thinks, this is great. We've extricated these girls and we can marry them off to a graduate of USC and a acclaimed doctor working in Butte. This is great. And so it made quite a bit of news that her work was trying to find these marriageable prospects. The pretty wedding of a Chinese couple at the Presbyterian home gives Dr. Lam a bride. The woman who was married to Dr. Lam goes by the name of Alice Lam, and here's their family up here in Butte. They have 7 children. By all accounts, they live a happy life. Alice teaches at the Chinese Baptist Mission here in Butte, trying to teach Christianity, trying to teach English, and so it worked out very, very well for the Lam family. It didn't always work out so well. Over in Bozeman, this is a marriage license between a guy named Tom Singh and his bride Na Loy. Okay? And it was said that this was the first marriage in the county. Now, Na Loy, we'll talk about her in a little bit. Tom Singh is a laundry worker in Bozeman. He has no prospects of bringing a bride over from China. Only merchants could do that at this point in time, and Tom Singh doesn't have that opportunity. But he knows that there is this Presbyterian mission home down in San Francisco that's freeing women and trying to get them married. So he writes to Donaldina Cameron, he writes to the Presbyterian mission home, and he tries to find a bride. But as he's doing all this, his sponsor in Bozeman is this white woman named Julia Emery, and she actually signs the marriage account there. And Julia Emery, who's been teaching Tom Singh English, who's been trying to help him in Bozeman, when Tom Singh tells her, hey, I'm about to get married, Julia Emery thinks, this doesn't sound right. And so Julia Emery writes, quote, but how can you marry? Not a white girl, surely. Yet you don't know any China women, there are no Chinese girls here. Have you bought a Chinese girl, paid $600 or $800 for her? And Tom Singh assured her, said, no, this is a true love match. He explained the situation, because this was the situation. This person named Na Loy had been sold from southern China at 7 years old in that Muay Thai system, had come over to San Francisco, had found herself in the brothels of San Francisco's Chinatown. Donaldina Cameron and her reformers had extricated her from that, had anglicized her, had taught her Christianity, had taught her English to the point that she didn't even know how to read or write or speak Chinese. Okay? And so Na Loy, you can see her here, is matched with Tom Singh up in Bozeman, and it seems like they're going to live happily ever after. And so Tom Singh brings Na Loy to Julia Emery, the white woman in Bozeman, and Julia Emery says, quote, he brought his heathen sweetheart and placed her in my care. She was bright and attractive, spoke and read English fairly well, and seemed perfectly at home in her new surroundings. Close questioning convinced me that this was a true love match, no bargain and sale, as I had feared, such as common on the Pacific coast. All they asked was American protection and freedom from molestation. It wasn't going to be. It wasn't going to be. Because it turns out that Na Loy had probably been promised to another Chinese man, another more powerful Chinese man, and Tom Singh and Na Loy coming together had wrecked those plans. And so connecting to Butte, this individual is from Butte's Chinatown. Lu Singh, no relation to Tom Singh, is dispatched from Butte over to Bozeman, and in broad daylight, downtown Bozeman, hacks Tom Singh to death. Yeah, I hope I woke you up there. It is not a good situation. He is immediately apprehended, and when questioned, why did you do this? What's going on? Lu Singh, the assassin, says that if Tom Singh was dead, he was glad and happy. And if he was not dead, I, Lu Singh, was not a very good Chinaman. And so clearly a hit had been put out. Now he gives himself up right away, and in fact he's eventually executed by the galloping gallows that maybe you've heard about here. They are sent over to Bozeman to facilitate this execution. But before he's executed, he's held in jail, right? Unfortunately, during all of this, it's found that she does not have the proper paperwork to be in America.
Oh dear.
Remember how she came over? 7 years old, sold into whatever circumstances she was in. Of course she doesn't have the proper paperwork. But she is jailed in Bozeman's jail, steps away from her husband's assassin.
Oh Lord.
Okay? And then deportation proceedings are started against Na Loy. Through no fault of her own, caught up in all of this, and it makes quite a splash. Okay? A lot of people across Montana take up her cause and try to fight for her to be allowed to stay here. Maybe because of her Christianity, her English nature, the circumstances of her life, the circumstances of her husband's death. A lot of Montanans fight for that. And they write, just what is to be gained by the deportation of Na Loi is not quite clear, except that the letter of the law is to be followed. She does not speak a word of her native language or write Chinese, according to the dispatches from Bozeman. She is educated in English, however, and is a member of the Presbyterian Church and lives an exemplary Christian life. Despite all this, she is to be sent back to China, a strange country to her, and where she will probably meet death or torture. Her case is even elevated all the way up to President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who can do nothing. Na Loi is eventually deported. She drops off the historic record. We have no idea what happens to her. Okay. So you can see the struggle to try and make families was indeed mighty. Now, the one allowance was that merchants could bring in a wife. And so after 1882, Chinese merchants, and there were quite a few, nowhere near the number as workers, but merchants were allowed to bring in a wife. This is paperwork here from the Butte Archives, which is such a great institution. I'm a big fan of it, and a lot of the research that I've done is based on sources collected here. This was a merchant's wife in Butte, and she kept this paperwork with her at all times, that if she was ever caught on the streets and questioned, she could produce this and say, no, my husband's a merchant. And so to try and just arm yourself against that deportation machine in which Na Loi had been caught up in. Okay. As we look a little bit more closely to Butte, this is the family of Hum Hua Long. And how a merchant would find a wife was difficult. Okay. Before we get into this family a little bit, oftentimes there'd be arranged marriages. The merchant wouldn't necessarily have the means or the opportunity to leave Montana and go all the way back to China to court and to go through the rituals. And so there'd be arranged marriages. And from one primary document, we get a sense of these arranged marriages. The husband and wife had never met. And the wife writes, quote, I was married by proxy. Back in southern China, a live rooster symbolized the bridegroom. A month after the marriage, I sailed for America with my husband's relative. On the day the boat docked at Port Townsend, he pointed to a figure walking up and down the wharf. He said, see that man smoking a big cigar? He is your husband. Okay. Now, to American officials, this didn't sound legitimate. When they're hearing of these arranged marriages and women coming in, what do American officials assume? It's a front for prostitution. Okay. And so American officials said, quote, the Chinaman would have to demonstrate to me that the woman is his wife according to our ideas of marriage. Yeah, how do you do that? Bicker over dinner or something like that of who's going to do the dish? I'm not sure. Yet eventually American officials relented and realized that was an unrealistic bar, and so they relented and allowed for these arranged marriages to be considered legal. Okay? Now, if Chinese women get into Montana and America, Chinese American families can happen. Because up until this point, and up until 1943, Chinese were not allowed to naturalize as citizens. You think about the great immigrant history of Butte, and many of them came over as one nationality and were transformed into Americans through that process. That was not allowed for Chinese. They were not allowed to become American citizens. The only way somebody of Chinese ethnicity could become an American citizen was to be born on American soil. And yet there were so few Chinese women, so few Chinese families, that was almost an impossibility. But we do have the Hum family here. And one of the people born in the Hum family is Rose Hum Lee. I'm sure many of you have heard of Rose Hum Lee. Born in Butte in 1904, and thus automatically an American citizen, but it's complicated. It's complicated. She goes on to a very illustrious career. She goes on to a great education. She becomes the first woman and first Asian American to head a university department in a major American university. So storied and great academic career and key contributor. But if you read her work and read between the lines, she's fraught with tensions about identity. Does she truly belong in Chinese society? Does she truly belong in white American society? She's caught in limbo, and this is why. Let's go back a step. In 1907, she's only 3 years old, so this doesn't seem to apply right away. But in 1907, an act was passed called the Expatriation Act. And what it said is that a woman's citizenship status was tied to that of her husband. And so if you were an American citizen as a woman, but you married a non-citizen, you'd lose your citizenship status. Okay, now let's go to when she's of a marriageable age. What are her marriage prospects? Are there many Chinese American male citizens? No, because we've talked about how few Chinese families could have children here. And so most of her marriage prospects, because you have to marry within the race, were Chinese men who didn't have American citizenship. And so she does indeed marry a Chinese man who has no American citizenship. She loses her American citizenship. She goes to southern China with him in the 1920s and 30s. Things don't work out. Her Americanness clashes with her in-laws' family's Chineseness. It just doesn't work out. And they divorce. She tries to come back into America. She's lost her citizenship. And she cannot naturalize as a citizen. Born in America, birthright citizenship stripped away from her because of the 1907 Expatriation Act. It's complicated. And I think if you read her work, you can see that tension because of what happened to her throughout it. And she actually wasn't terribly mentally healthy late in her life, and I think a lot of that goes back to this untethered nature of things. She eventually does regain her citizenship when laws change in the 1930s. She marries again, lives down in Phoenix, Arizona. Her work is very, very important, but it's such a sad story of her personal life going in that direction. Up north in Helena, we have the merchant Li Samfong. Li Samfong. Just a note, this is his family name. In Chinese culture, the family name comes first. Your family is more important than your individuality. So he's of the Li family. And he's a merchant in Helena, doing pretty well. He wants to go back to China and get a bride. But he knows he needs to try and protect himself. And so he gets this, he composes this letter, and he has 22 key figures in Montana politics attest to the fact that Li Samfong is a good guy. We've got sitting Supreme Court justices, former Supreme Court justices, former governors, we've got former bishops of the state of Montana, all saying, yeah, Li Samfong is a stand-up guy. And he hopes that this will allow him to cross borders, to go to China and bring a wife back in, and he does indeed do that. In 1890, he travels to China, marries, and brings a wife back to Montana. By 1893, they're expecting their first baby, and it was indeed born. The Helena newspaper says, the first Chinese baby born in lawful wedlock in Helena happened last night. But Li Samfong was pretty nervous, as an expectant father would be, and as she was going into labor, he went down to the fire station and asked the firemen for help, and just, what do I do? Let's help deliver this baby. They did give help, but then they said, quote, the newspaper said, quote, they feared that the U.S. Marshal will be after them for having assisted in bringing a Chinaman into this country. They're joking, of course, right? But the newspaper did say that she had citizenship, the daughter that was born had citizenship, and thus she can go to China and return as she pleases, being an American citizen. Well, we know American citizenship means more than just being able to travel back and forth to China. What else could it mean? In Montana by 1914, voting rights for women. But would Chinese American women be allowed to vote? It's interesting. It's interesting. So here's the early morning arrival of the first Chinese baby born in lawful wedlock. He goes on to have several other daughters. These are the Li daughters. And in 1916, when they go to register to vote, the clerk of the court who's trying to register them says, I'm not so sure. Not because of their gender, but because of their ethnicity. So he was not sure that they were entitled to registration, due not to their gender, but their ethnicity. He elevated these up to the county attorney, and it was finally determined that they were, quote, qualified under the law to have all the rights of other women in the state. Asked for whom they would vote, each sister said that she was going to vote for the best man. As we know, in 1916, they had other options in Montana as well. Okay? And so the Li sisters are maybe a happier story than that split identity that Rose Hum Lee down here in Butte struggled with. Going east to Billings, if you can marry, what else can you do? Divorce. And Billings newspapers talked about this woman, Montana's strangest social reformer, a Chinese girl who thinks the American way is the right way. She first got on the attention of Billings newspaper reporters because she was filing for divorce. What is undoubtedly the first petition for divorce ever filed in the state in which both the plaintiff and defendant are Chinese. And she is granted a divorce. The article went on to note that she is dainty, petite, 21 years of age, and remarkably handsome for a Chinese woman. Definitely qualified, right? But when they asked her what her dreams were, she gave an extensive interview. And this wasn't just reported in Montana newspapers. I found this same article in Mississippi and Ohio and Iowa talking about this woman, Annie Louie. She said, quote, the article said, instead of competing with American working men, Chinese people will occupy their niche in the world and all will work to a common end, the betterment of the condition of mankind. Such is the dream of little Annie Louie, who with American notions has some very broad ideas of reform. She believes that her, quote, Mongolian brethren would make valuable and worthy members of labor unions. Pretty controversial when you think about often the labor unions fighting against the Chinese for undercutting wages. Were they only taught what it means? She proposes in doing just that. She's going to be the one to teach her Chinese brothers and sisters what a labor union means and how to join and how to fight for workers' rights. Her plan is simple enough. She would join a labor organization herself and teach the doctrines in every city in the US where there's a Chinese laundry or tea store. A very laudable ambition, is it not? She cherishes the plan to redeem her countrymen from the race prejudice which exists. She secured employment in a Billings restaurant where she is still working and studying for the time when she will start upon her evangelical work. What eventually happens to Annie Louis I can never find. I can never trace her in the records. And so she rises in this one moment of excitement and earnest attempt to collaborate with white workers, and then is a blip off the radar screen. This last person that I'll focus on doesn't seem connected to Montana at first. She's born in Hawaii in 1903. Her name is Ahi Young, but she goes by the stage name of Sue Young. Stage name, how'd she get on the stage? Well, this is kind of a long story. She's born in Hawaii, very talented student, born in the territory of Hawaii, not yet a state, of course, until 1959, but that did confer American citizenship. Now, she does really well in middle school and in high school, and she wants to be a teacher. She actually wants to go to Columbia University and study at Columbia's Teacher College. But getting from the territory of Hawaii into mainland America was difficult. Finally, in 1927, she's allowed to come in with the qualified status of Chinese in America. She's an American citizen. You don't need to put that, but it was put on all of her paperwork. And she goes to study at Columbia and studies education. She's one of only 50 Chinese American women studying in higher education at the time. And when she's doing her coursework uptown at Columbia University, she also goes down to Broadway. She loves to act. And when she's acting, she gains the notice of this Chinese troupe led by Mei Lan Fang. Now this is Peking opera or Beijing opera. If you know anything about Peking opera, the main characters are supposed to be women, but they're played by men. And Mei Lan Fang was the most well-known globally Peking opera star. And he's coming on American tour. Okay? But he only speaks Chinese, and the troupe only speaks Chinese, but if they're going to try and debut this Peking opera to American audiences, they need a mistress of ceremonies. And so who do they go to? They go to Sue Young. Okay? Ahi Young or Sue Young, she's in New York, she speaks English, she speaks Chinese. She becomes the mistress of ceremonies, and it said, Mr. May is supported by his own company of actors, dancers and musicians in 4 short plays and dances, the meaning of which is fully explained before each scene by the charming mistress of ceremonies, Miss Sue Young. And they travel from New York to San Francisco putting on the Peking opera. It was a hit. It was $500 a table, $1,000 for balcony seats. And this is 1931-32, right? It was a hit. It was a sensation. And as Sue Young is traveling all across the nation, she meets important Chinese investors. She also meets important Montana mining interests. And she actually becomes interested in mining in Montana in 1931-32. She meets a man named R.A. Brett, who has connections here to Butte. And she decides to study in Butte to become a mining engineer. And so there's our Montana connection. And it was said that she's the only Chinese woman mining engineer in the world. I think that's overstating it a little bit. She didn't actually get her degree. She was definitely studying towards that. But to say that she achieved it, it doesn't belie the fact she was working towards it. Since her arrival in Butte 4 months ago, she has acquired an intense enthusiasm for mining prospects here in the Treasure State. She intends to devote her life to mining engineering and is at present studying under R.A. Brett, president of the Winnetka Company. Later, she expects to seek a formal engineering education. And the Winnetka mine tries to open up down in the old areas of Alder Gulch and Virginia City and those areas. And she knows her history. This is an article out of Hawaii, and she talks about the history of Chinese miners in Montana. She says, Chinese once mined in the placers of Alder Gulch, and it is altogether fitting that one of their race should aid in bringing a renaissance to the famous camp. I feel that mining engineering is not only a natural but worthy ambition for a Chinese girl. Only I shall have to be a good miner to live up to the traditions of the race. And so she's got this fascinating story. Born in Hawaii, educated in New York, and is now in Montana. Her mining prospects don't take off quite as much as her Hollywood prospects do. And she leaves to pursue her acting career. She acts alongside Greta Garbo in The Painted Veil, Mae West in Klondike Annie, Clark Gable and Jean Harlow in China Seas, and Gary Cooper in The Adventures of Marco Polo. She has an amazing Hollywood career. And there's news of a production, an adaptation of Pearl Buck's novel, The Good Earth, and she tries to get the main character role. The main character's name is Olan. And so Sue Young writes, she was eager to play Olan, the central character of the film. I want to play her as an intelligent, respectful Chinese wife, not a stupid woman who takes her husband's blows without complaint. I want to make her the great kind of woman I knew in my own village, the Chinese woman unknown to the American screen. Chinese women are quite as modern as American women. They have representatives in almost every profession. Okay. She didn't get the role. Anna May Wong didn't get the role. In fact, nobody of Chinese ethnicity got the role. Olan was played by a German-born actress. Okay. She goes on, though, Sue Young, Ah-hee Young. She keeps her connections in Montana and visits Montana quite frequently. Later in life, in the 40s and 50s, she comes to Billings frequently, connecting with people that she'd known back from her past and her mining days. And she's developed a one-woman play that she debuts in Billings several times. It's called Out from the Inner Apartment. And she depicts Chinese women as modern, empowered, and intelligent. And so with people like Ah-hee Young, Sue Young, I hope that we can get past this anonymous Chinese-American woman of the 1870 census and see these Chinese-American, Chinese-Montanan women as they emerge to us more fully formed, more complex, more independent, with agency, with hopes and dreams, see them as they saw themselves, as family members stretching around the globe, as activists, as workers, trying to remake their country, their families, Montana, through their experiences here. Thank you very much.